Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Alex's dissertation defense. Before I introduce Alex, let me explain how the defense is going to work today. So Alex will have about 45 minutes to present his dissertation work. After that time, there will be about 15 minutes left for questioning. If you have a question for Alex about his work, please put it in the chat box and I will read it to him. I'll cut off questioning at the hour so that Alex can meet with his defense committee, dissertation defense committee. So Alex and I go way back. We first met his junior year in my climate change course. After that course, Alex completed a senior thesis with me examining climate change over Central Africa in response to an RCP 8.5 scenario. After earning dual BS degrees in Earth and Environmental Sciences and PIPE, Alex then left UM and worked for an environmental consulting firm in Boston for a year. Once he left, I didn't think that I would hear from him again. So I was thrilled when he reached out a year later and asked about attending graduate school at the University of Michigan. One of the things that have impressed me most about Alex is that he has always known exactly what he wanted from his graduate training. As we were discussing his return to UM for graduate studies 4.5 years ago, he said he wanted to investigate hydrological responses to climate change in order to inform climate models and future climate prediction in susceptible regions. And that's exactly what he's done in his dissertation. As you'll hear today, Alex's dissertation focuses on Holocene climate change and specifically investigates the role of surface vegetation forcing on the West African and North American monsoon systems. His dissertation work also reconciles long-standing differences between climate model simulations and proxy interpretations of Holocene climate and makes a very compelling argument that vegetation change and its associated feedbacks were a major forcing and driving Holocene climate. The second thing that has impressed me about Alex is his commitment to science communication and public outreach. Alex completed a museum science communication fellowship and has given a number of public presentations locally on both climate models and on Holocene climate. He's also been very engaged in Earth Camp and has served as a camp counselor for multiple years for the camp. It's truly been a pleasure to work with and to get to know Alex over the last 8 years. He will definitely be missed. Alex will be starting a postdoc with Bronwyn Koenigke's lab at Washington University in August. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris, for the kind words. I want to reiterate just a couple things about Zoom. As Chris said, you can type questions into the chat during the presentation. And now, as I start my portion of the presentation, I want to ask everyone to please mute your microphones and turn off your video to reduce any disruptions that this could cause during the presentation. So I'm really pleased to present my work over the last several years to all of you during my PhD. I've been using climate models to understand the regional and global climate responses to Holocene land surface change. And I'm going to present several chapters of my dissertation here today and share this work with you. So the large motivation for why I'm doing the research I am in my dissertation is that in the modern day, there are large changes to the land surface that are happening throughout the globe. For example, we can see large deforestation that's occurring, and you can actually see it from space as this image is showing. Deforestation occurs for changes in agriculture, but there are also other somewhat more natural changes to the land surface like desertification or increases in vegetation that are occurring throughout the world. So we know that these are happening throughout the world, but what we don't really know very well is the climate impacts that will happen because of this land surface change. So the broad motivation of the dissertation work that I've done is to look at a time in the recent past. So here I'm looking at the Holocene epoch, which is about the last 12,000 years and is technically still the time period that we are in presently. So by looking at the Holocene, this can tell us how the climate responded to land surface changes in the recent past to inform us of how it may change in the future. So to set up a roadmap for what I'm going to be talking today, we are going to be looking at the Holocene land surface impacts on African hydroclimate. And I'm going to share 2 chapters from my dissertation and the results from those on African hydroclimate. And then I'm going to be looking at global temperature and how this was impacted by Holocene land surface change in another chapter. So why study Holocene climate change? Well, the Holocene is a relatively short time in Earth's recent past, and it's a very important climate state because it's very similar to the background climate of today. It's this fairly warm interglacial time since the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago that allowed our civilization to evolve. As you can see here, with human civilization basically evolved during the Holocene. So studying Holocene climate change makes it informative for near future climate change. Now, the Holocene is a really interesting short time period, and it was relatively stable in its global climate. As this figure on the left shows, Holocene temperature was pretty stable relative to the last glacial maximum or the glacial interglacial cycles back to the last million or more years ago. And this is largely because greenhouse gases have been fairly stable throughout the Holocene. And also ice cover has been fairly stable since at least about the mid-Holocene, 6,000 years ago. And there were some ice cover changes before that, but 6,000 years ago to now has pretty much been the same amount of ice. But what we see is that changes in Holocene climate have occurred through the seasonal changes in orbital insolation. In other words, how much sunlight reaches the surface of the Earth during different seasons. Now, the reason for these changes is that Earth's axial precession, or in other words, the wobble of Earth's axis as it orbits the sun, has changed. And what this does is it changes how much sunlight actually is received in certain seasons. So for example, in the modern day, when the Northern Hemisphere experiences summer, this actually occurs when the Earth is further away in its orbit from the sun. Yet axial precession changed in the early Holocene about 9,000 years ago. And that wobble actually allowed the Northern Hemisphere summer to occur when the Earth was closer to the sun in its orbit. So this had about the impact of 7% greater Northern Hemisphere summer insolation. So in other words, about 7% more sunlight was reaching the Northern Hemisphere during its summer. So this had profound impacts on the land surface and climate regionally, especially throughout the Northern Hemisphere, as large changes to the Sahara Desert actually resulted in a greening, with grassland replacing what today is the largest desert in the world. And throughout the Northern Hemisphere, there were other changes, such as in the Arctic, boreal forest actually replaced some areas of tundra. So we had these large land surface changes. Some evidence that we can look to for the reason as to why we see these changes comes from paleoclimate proxies. And these are just a host of examples of these types of proxies from pollen, which can tell us how much moisture was available for these different plants to grow. This tells us that it was much wetter in the Sahara, in Europe, throughout the mid-latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere, and even in the Arctic. We can also look at the geochemical records that are essentially the chemical signature of mud that can tell us through some interpretations how wet it might have been in the past. So for example, during this time, about 5,000 to 12,000 years ago, we can see an excursion in these chemical records that would suggest wetter conditions. And then we can look at dust which when there is a lot of vegetation, we're not going to mobilize as much dust or sand from the surface. So this time actually saw a much reduced dust flux. However, in the scientific community, we've actually had quite a disagreement between climate models and this proxy data when trying to recreate these changes in climate during the Holocene. For example, in Africa, the climate proxies have actually showed a significant increase in rainfall, but the models have only showed a smaller increase. So one of the possible reasons for why we think this may have happened in our studies is that few modeling studies have actually directly incorporated this Holocene land surface change. For instance, the Paleoclimate Modeling Group guidelines have specified a pre-industrial land surface, which is the pre-industrial is around 1850 AD, before humans started adding copious amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So this is essentially similar to modern. So for all intents and purposes, this is a large desert in the Sahara, which is much different than that green Sahara environment we know occurred. So this is likely a reason that we're not seeing the same reconciliation between models and proxies. So the broad overarching goal of my dissertation is to look at this fairly simple question: how can we improve agreement between paleoclimate models and proxy data in their reconstruction of Holocene climate change? And the tool that I'm using as a scientific tool to look at this question is called the Community Earth System Model, or CESM for short. And this is a global Earth system model that looks at fluxes between the atmosphere and land and cryosphere and oceanic components, solving these equations of motion and thermodynamics through these different components. And what is really unique and cool about a model like this is we can actually look at how changes to the land surface, like a desert Sahara in this scenario versus a greened Sahara in this scenario, how these changes in the land surface actually impact the climate. So there are many benefits of using this tool. One of them is that it provides a global depiction of Earth and climate system change. So we can look at changes in Africa, but also see how they impact climate throughout the globe. And they also allow us to evaluate some of these underlying mechanisms or reasons for these changes in climate. So for example, one of the things that we do in climate modeling is using something called a sensitivity experiment, where we take a climate model simulation, like one with a green Sahara, and we can simulate the rainfall associated with that Sahara, with that climate. And then we can also take a different simulation where we change the vegetation and have a desert Sahara. So then when we take the difference between the two, we are essentially looking at the impact of vegetation. So in this case, when we have green minus desert, we actually can see that the green Sahara case has higher rainfall associated with it. So therefore, we can conclude that a greening of the Saharan region leads to an increase in rainfall. So there are some limitations that we need to keep in mind when looking at CESM results, however, because this is a climate model that represents the Earth system processes on a grid, as you can see these squares here. It does have a somewhat simplistic representation of the Earth and climate system. This has to happen because we're representing these global processes in a computationally economic way. But in order to think about our results this way, we are really looking at simulating the large-scale climate features, such as large-scale hydrologic change in Africa, and we're not paying attention to some of the finer details that are not captured as well by the model. So using this tool of CESM and comparing it to proxy records can leverage the strengths of both and allow the proxies to kind of ground truth these model results, because the proxies are actually something that happened, right? But they require interpretations, and there's a very complex environmental processes going on there. But the models allow us to analyze some of these physical mechanisms responsible for the climate change or the reasons that we see this change. So just as an example, we can look at proxy change like this would be the chemical signature of leaf waxes. And we can actually quantify some change from a pre-industrial and mid-Holocene case and actually place that difference on a sensitivity experiment with the climate model. So we are able to actually compare and try to better understand hydrology. So let's get started thinking about model data disagreements in African hydroclimate. And first, we're going to be looking at just the mid-Holocene, so this fixed point in time, 6,000 years ago. So in Africa, the largest land surface change during the mid-Holocene was this shift of the Sahara Desert to more of a mixed environment of grasses and shrubs and trees with much more organic soil, something like what you might see more in more southern locations in Africa today, like the Serengeti. So when we're trying to understand how that may have impacted African hydroclimate, we are looking at the West African monsoon, which is essentially the northward shift and reversal of winds that draws rainfall north into the Sahel region just south of the Sahara and the southern Sahara during the months of June to September. So in its simulation of that enhancement of the West African monsoon, climate models have typically underestimated this increase during the mid-Holocene. Proxy records, like chemical signatures, have shown that the monsoon limit probably reached up to 31 degrees north, but climate models that have been developed throughout the world have shown that simulation of African hydroclimate often falls short of the proxy records, not just the northernmost limit, but throughout the Sahara region, that hydroclimate increase is typically underestimated. So in trying to solve some of these problems, other studies have looked at additional mechanisms that may strengthen the monsoon during the mid-Holocene. They have seen that vegetation might increase the rainfall, or that the radiative effect, so that how it impacts sunlight of dust, might impact this. But these mechanisms in the past have either shown that they can't quite reach that northernmost limit, or they don't include all the relevant factors that need to be accounted for. So particularly, one study has looked at the direct radiative effects of dust, which if you were in Michigan last summer, you might have seen these spectacular sunsets that were the result of Saharan dust over Michigan. And this is basically what the direct radiative effects are. It's the scattering of solar radiation, and it can create beautiful sunsets like we saw in Michigan. So one study has looked at these effects, but no studies so far have looked at the other dominant effect of dust, which is actually the ways that it interacts with dust, with cloud particles. Or dust particles can act as cloud condensation nuclei. So basically, the clouds can form around these dust particles. And these have very uncertain impacts on monsoonal rainfall. So no studies have looked at this before, but we know from the global radiative forcing that these dust aerosol cloud interactions actually may have a larger effect on climate than the aerosol radiative interactions. So this is potentially a very interesting factor to look at. So in this first chapter of my dissertation, I'm asking two pretty simple questions. How do dust aerosol cloud interactions impact the West African monsoon in the mid-Holocene? And then further, can they actually help reconcile the models with proxy data? So this is what I've investigated in the first chapter of my dissertation, which is a study published in Geophysical Research Letters. And here I'm using the atmosphere model coupled to the land model of CESM. And I'm looking at a somewhat model-centric approach, because in this model, it's one of the first that actually includes indirect aerosol cloud effects in its model physics. And it does so for stratiform clouds, which are depicted here and are essentially more associated with the frontal movement. And they don't have as much rainfall associated with them as the other dominant type of cloud, which we call convective. So think of convective clouds as your cumulonimbus, thunderstorm clouds, and stratiform clouds are more of those frontal movement clouds. So when I'm looking at these climate model simulations, I'm trying to find the impact of reduced dust aerosols on African climate. So here we're thinking back to those sensitivity experiments I described before. So we can think about this as a mid-Holocene minus pre-industrial sensitivity experiment, or more specifically, a low dust, which you can see in this plot here, versus a high dust case. So this is how we're going to try to understand the impact of dust on climate. So thinking about those previous studies that looked at the direct radiative effects, a reduction in dust ends up leading to increased convective rainfall, as you can see with the blue colors here throughout the Sahel and the Sahara. And because convective rainfall is about 70% of the rainfall in this region, an increase in convective rainfall will increase the total rainfall signal. However, when we see the same reduction in dust and look at the indirect aerosol effect pathway, we actually see that that stratiform rainfall is reduced when the dust aerosols are reduced. So here we're seeing the reds as reduced rainfall. So because stratiform rainfall is not as prevalent in this area as convective rainfall, it does not reverse that signal. But instead of further increasing to try to meet that 31 degrees north line, we're actually dampening that increase. So overall, we see that the dust effects are increasing, but having a more dampened rainfall signal of that increase. So overall, that model-centric approach shows us that the total effect of dust is to increase African monsoonal rainfall, but the indirect aerosol cloud effects actually are not reconciling models and proxies, because instead of leading to that further increase, they're dampening that increase by a little bit. So we need to keep going. We can think about some other possible ways to try to reconcile this model proxy disagreement. So how about a more proxy-centric approach to try to evaluate some of the interpretations that are made with these proxy records? So for instance, stable water isotopes are something that is used very commonly as a proxy for African rainfall, and they are used as a tool for predicting past rainfall rates. Specifically, leaf wax isotopes, which leaf waxes are these waxy cuticles that are on leaves and vegetation that can actually be shed into the environment. So then when we take a sediment core of these leaf waxes, we can actually look at the chemical signature through time and make a reconstruction of leaf wax isotope, the chemical signature that we see here. And they are interpreted as showing in the mid-Holocene, actually these large excursions in the chemical signature that is associated with increased rainfall. So what are stable water isotopes actually? As I said, they are the chemical signal of rainfall that are preserved in things like leaf waxes. And so when we're thinking of leaf waxes, we're going to think about hydrogen atoms and go back to our very elementary chemistry with a hydrogen atom, which is basically the simplest atom there is. It consists of one proton and one electron. That's what defines it as a hydrogen atom. But there are actually naturally occurring hydrogen isotopes, which are the same thing. They work the same way atomically, but they actually have an extra neutron. So when it has an extra neutron, we can call this 2H or deuterium D. And basically the difference between these two is like a ping pong ball and a golf ball. So think of hydrogen as it's light and lighter than the deuterium, which is more like a golf ball. So they're very similar size and color, but the ping pong ball hydrogen is much lighter than the golf ball deuterium. So the way that we notate these isotopes is by what we call delta D. And this is essentially what this equation boils down to, is it's a ratio of the heavy, the golf balls, to the light ping pong balls. So we can use these isotopes, these hydrogen isotopes, as tracers of past hydrologic conditions with these interpretations. So the way that this works is when we have evaporation, if you think about the weight differences between a ping pong ball and a golf ball, it's easier to lift more of those ping pong balls. So we end up with more negative values, so more of those ping pong balls. However, some of those golf balls do make it up there. And when it starts to rain, those are essentially the first to go because they are heavier. The cloud wants to get rid of them essentially. And as we keep raining and raining and raining, all that's left are ping pong balls, right? So the more rain that occurs, we're just seeing more and more and more ping pong balls. So this is essentially what the amount effect interpretation tells us. It says that there's an inverse relationship between delta D and the rainfall amount. So if there's higher rainfall, we would expect to see more of those ping pong balls or more of the light isotope. So this also is very critical when we're thinking of leaf waxes, because it assumes that the delta D of precipitation is the same or roughly the same as the delta D of soil, because that's essentially the connector between precipitation and the delta D of wax, or the leaf wax is the soil water. So previous studies have shown in delta D wax in mid-Holocene Africa that a record from 31 degrees north actually shows this more negative excursion of more ping pong balls that actually suggests that the monsoon may have reached that latitude. So what we're going to look at in the second chapter is actually try to evaluate how robust is this interpretation that the leaf wax isotopes are representing past rainfall rates, and in telling us that the monsoon probably did reach that 31 degrees north, or maybe it did not. So that's what we're looking at in this second chapter that is published in Earth and Planetary Science Letters. And here what I'm using for CESM is the same model. It's fully coupled throughout the globe, but now we actually have isotope tracers throughout each model component. So we're able to compare the isotopes in the model to the isotopes in the proxies. So starting off here, we can look at a sensitivity experiment, same as we saw in the chapter before, of mid-Holocene minus pre-industrial. And the large change to the land surface here that we're seeing is that vegetation, the greening of the Sahara. And we can actually place those leaf wax records on here as well. So for instance, this record up here is actually that same record that we saw here of 31 degrees north. So when we first look at these results, we can look at the delta D of precipitation. So essentially we're looking at the difference in the mid-Holocene minus the pre-industrial. And I want to show you that in our model simulations, we're seeing more positive values, which are essentially more of those golf balls in that rainfall isotope. So if we want to look at this interpretation, we first want to ask, does the soil isotope match the precipitation isotope? So looking at the soil isotope, we can pretty much see right away that up here in Northwestern Africa, we're not seeing the same difference in soil water isotopes as we are in precipitation. So we want to try to understand, first and foremost, is the model simulating this robust, accurate result? And if so, why do we see this disagreement between the leaf waxes for precipitation, but not for soil water? So the result that we are simulating of a more positive difference in African delta D of rainfall is, it makes physical sense for the following reason. In a desert environment like we have in the pre-industrial, there is much more evaporation from the bare ground. And evaporation, like I said before, is what we call a fractionating process, which means it prefers more of those ping pong balls. So the water vapor that goes into the atmosphere ends up having more of the ping pong balls, the lighter hydrogen atoms in it. But in a vegetated environment like occurred in the mid-Holocene, there was much more vegetation throughout, and this led to more transpiration, which is that transfer of water through the plants as opposed to the bare soil like evaporation. And what's important about transpiration is that it's actually thought of as a non-fractionating process. So it takes the exact ratio of those golf balls to ping pong balls in the soil water and transfers them with that exact ratio to the atmosphere. So when we look at the difference between a vegetated and a desert case, in the vegetated case, we have way more of those golf balls ending up into the atmosphere and being rained out. So that's why we're seeing this positive anomaly or difference in the model. But this is actually conflicting with these leaf wax records. So what we're showing with this model proxy comparison is that these leaf waxes may actually not be representing precipitation. Instead, they may be capturing that signal of soil water, because we saw that that soil water was agreeing with the sign of the proxy leaf wax records. But because we're seeing this disconnect, essentially the soil and leaf waxes are agreeing, but the precipitation itself is different due to those changes in vegetation and the isotopic flux changes there. So overall, when we compare our isotopic changes and try to think about now the hydrology that is associated with that, when we look at the northernmost limits, we see leaf waxes as 31 degrees north, which I presented before. But these leaf waxes are likely an overestimation. And that's because they're not quite capturing that signal of precipitation. Instead, they're capturing that soil water signal. So they're not as informative for a pure precipitation signal of 31 degrees north. Instead, other proxy records like dust and pollen have showed us somewhat more mediated northernmost limits of 23 to 28 degrees north. And this aligns with our simulated northernmost limit of about 24 degrees north. So here we're concluding that the broad range here from dust and pollen is maybe a little bit more accurate than these leaf waxes, which may be overestimating that limit. So to conclude on the part one, looking at Africa, we've looked at a model-centric approach, which was able to put better constraints on the monsoon response to dust. But we saw that those indirect aerosol cloud effects did not resolve the disagreement between the models and proxies. So instead, we turned to looking at the proxies, and we're able to actually somewhat refine their interpretation of African water isotopes and see here that instead of a 31 degree north limit, it's probably more in the range of 23 to 28 degrees north. Okay. So we've seen somewhat resolution of this model proxy disagreement in Africa. And now we're going to change gears and look at global temperature and its impact by Holocene land surface change throughout the Holocene now, instead of in a fixed point in time. So why is Holocene temperature reconstruction really important for us as humans? Well, it actually provides a historical context for our modern global warming. So we can see we're somewhere around here. This may have changed in the last couple of years, but we can essentially see how far of a deviation from the more natural Holocene temperature we are going as we continue to add carbon dioxide into our atmosphere and rapidly warm the Earth. So by providing this historical context, Holocene temperature reconstruction is very important. So in trying to reconstruct these temperatures, several proxies from around the world, these compilations, have shown what we can call a Holocene thermal maximum. So it's essentially this peak in Holocene temperatures around 7,000 to 6,000 years ago. And since that peak, there is a cooling trend towards the pre-industrial, about 1850 AD. So as we're looking at model proxy disagreements, though, this is a pretty big one. The models instead are simulating a constant warming trend throughout the Holocene. So this is a big difference, and it has spawned this phrase called the Holocene temperature conundrum, which is showcasing this large disagreement between the models and the proxies. So this is really important to resolve if we want to understand why Holocene temperatures changed the way that they did, and just understanding where Holocene temperatures were in the past. So in looking at why the climate models are probably showing this warming, their warming correlates with a small rise in CO2, carbon dioxide over this time period, not at all the kind of rise that we're seeing presently, about 20 parts per million, and a decline in global ice cover. So here I've inverted the axis so you can see the trend that would go upward as declining ice cover would lead to warming of the simulations. However, One of the largest changes that occurred during the early and mid-Holocene was the large northern hemisphere increases in vegetation cover, and previous models have not adequately accounted for these changes in vegetation and how they may have impacted global temperature. So for instance, we saw large changes in temperate deciduous forest in Europe. So we can see a northward shift, as this image is showing, and a expansion. I showed this figure before in the presentation, but we saw increases in plant cover throughout the Sahara, Europe, Eurasian mid-latitudes, and Arctic. So these were very large changes to the land surface that potentially had a large change in temperature, but they have not been investigated previously. So what my third chapter here is trying to investigate is this very simple question of, can northern hemisphere vegetation change resolve this Holocene temperature conundrum and bring these models from a warming trend to actually a Holocene thermal maximum with a cooling trend. So I am looking at this in the third chapter that is submitted to Science Advances. And what I'm using here is the same fully coupled CESM simulation. And now, instead of only looking at sensitivity experiments in a fixed point in time, I'm actually looking at what we can call time slice simulations of the pre-industrial, 3,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, and 9,000 years ago. And first, I use simulations that only include pre-industrial vegetation. So these have a desert in the Sahara, they have Arctic tundra and grasslands throughout the mid-latitudes. But then what I can do is I can add a sensitivity experiment to 6,000 and 9,000 years ago that first green the Sahara. Then I can add another sensitivity experiment that includes that Saharan greening and adds boreal forest replacing the tundra in the Arctic. And then lastly, in 6,000 and 9,000 years ago, I can put the Sahara and Arctic change and then add mid-latitude greening to that as well. And then I also have some partial greening in the 3,000 years ago case that some pollen records have suggested. So when we are going to look at these simulations, we can see that the simulations with pre-industrial vegetation, so here we're including changes like the orbit and greenhouse gases, but we are not including any vegetation change in any of these simulations. So we can see that these agree with the previous simulations where from the early Holocene to the pre-industrial, we have a warming trend. However, when we add the green Sahara and some partial 3,000 years ago greening, we can see that this significantly increases global temperatures. When we further add our Arctic vegetation, this even further warms the temperatures. And then when we add the combination of all three, so this is kind of the most realistic scenario that we can think of as the Holocene, with greening in the Sahara, mid-latitudes, and the Arctic. This leads to much better agreement with the proxies, as we can see that the one standard deviation line falls pretty much within the proxies and the global model results. So here we see that vegetation has largely resolved this disagreement when we look at global temperatures, but we want to make sure that vegetation is a robust reason for warming these global temperatures, and it's not essentially what we could say giving us the right answer for the wrong reason. So one way that we can do this is by looking at whether vegetation resolves these discrepancies in regional temperatures as well. So here we can look at regional temperatures. And the reason that we want to do this is to understand that vegetation is actually warming temperatures correctly and matching the models and proxies throughout areas that have a lot of proxy data, to understand that this is that vegetation is the right mechanism to warm and reconcile this disagreement. So here we have the Northern Hemisphere Arctic region. the northern hemisphere mid-latitudes, and the northern hemisphere tropics and southern hemisphere tropics, which are areas that have a lot of data density for temperature proxies. So they are areas to provide robust matches with models and proxies. So first, what we can see is that global temperature, or these regional temperatures rather, are too cold with pre-industrial vegetation. So here, each of these simulations does not change its vegetation extent. But what we see is regionally, this conundrum is also resolved. As we can see, these large changes in vegetation end up warming temperatures and matching proxies in each of these latitude bands in each of these regions. So we can conclude that this northern hemisphere vegetation is driving this maximum in Holocene temperatures, and it is resolving the conundrum in both global and regional temperatures. We can also see that we are actually able to accurately simulate Holocene temperature by resolving this model proxy disagreement and showing this Holocene thermal maximum and cooling thereafter. But what's really critical here is that accurate simulation of these Holocene temperatures actually requires the inclusion of vegetation changes. So if we do not account for these vegetation changes like the previous modeling studies did, we're not going to accurately simulate these Holocene temperatures. So this is a very important finding. So that concludes the second part here. And I want to now just talk about some of the main takeaways of my dissertation work in basically two main takeaways. And the first here is that Holocene land surface changes can actually resolve these model proxy disagreements in hydroclimate. I've shown this in Africa, where we see a model-centric approach better constraining some of these dust effects, but showing that they actually aren't able to resolve the model proxy disagreement until we look at the proxies a little bit more and with stable isotopes kind of understand and reinterpret some of the interpretations from leaf waxes and other proxy records in their northernmost limit of the monsoon in the mid-Holocene. Holocene land surface changes can also resolve model proxy disagreements in temperature. So we've seen this in global temperature, where vegetation changes throughout the northern hemisphere lead to a Holocene thermal maximum and cooling thereafter. So we're able to see this in temperature as well. So then finally, I just want to show that my work is really telling us that models must incorporate these land surface changes in order to accurately predict changes in climate. So I've shown this from changes in past climates. We can see that we're more accurately simulating changes in African hydroclimate and global temperature when we include and account for these land surface changes. And this also has a very big implication for future climate, that we need to make sure we're paying attention to these large land surface changes that are likely to occur in the future, because as I've showed in the past, it's imperative that we at least more closely simulate these and predict these changes in vegetation and other types of land surface if we are going to accurately predict future changes in temperature and hydroclimate.